All right, guys. Hey, guys. Welcome to the Daily Word Verse by Verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we continue in our study through Matthew. Excuse me, Matthew's Gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, verse by verse and chapter by chapter. We are in chapter 10, and we're going to continue. But I want to bring pose a question before we get into this. I want to pose a question, and um, um, because what Jesus is getting ready to get into here, um, I, especially for us in our culture, excuse me, and in our time, especially our culture and time, uh, we okay, so especially for our culture and our time, um, our mindsets as Christians, okay, our mindsets as Christians, what we think, how we think, and how we move about in the world, um, has been, I think, very, very contaminated, not by humanistic, okay, the seeds of it, humanistic thought, meaning, and just to kind of clarify and simplify, we focus on we focus on self. We focus on what my dreams are, what my uh, um, and it's all about me, my feelings, my goals, how I feel, right? To the point that even theologies have been developed to nourish that. God just wants whatever you want. God just, if you have teachings that build upon the promises of God, right? In other words, God made these promises for me. So now I have to, I have all of these I have these I have these problems, I have these problems, um, um, not problems, but perceptions of God, okay? And I, I'm kind of distracted because I kind of hit something I shouldn't have hit. And I don't know if my feed is going to go off, but anyway, we'll see. Okay, but anyway, um, but if my whole mind construction, if my whole mindset is constructed around what I'm supposed to get, when I'm supposed to, um, you know, be fulfilled. Um, we went through, we concluded in Second Timothy. One of the things that Paul was able to say was that he had completed his course. He completed what God had given him, and um, when that's important. That's an important perspective. What I oftentimes say that is one of my main prayers, that I can come to the end of my life, and whenever that is. See, only God knows that. That I can come to the end of my life, and I won't have a grandiose prayer by saying or statement to say, "Well, I've traveled the world, made all the money, done all of these things in here." If that's your boast, or even regret, Jesus is getting ready to bust that. Let me just tell you right now that Jesus is getting ready to bust that. And so again, brace yourself, because again, a lot of people treat God as if they're treating the world. And let me give you an example. I'll give you an example. Um, I'm angry at God. So if you ask the question, why are you angry at God? Well, because God did not do something for me. God did not, and that's kind of the root statement. God did not, excuse me, do something for me. So I'm angry at God because he didn't do something for me. Right? I'm angry at God because my loved one died. I'm angry at God because I didn't get that job. I'm angry at God because I don't have the house that I desire to live in. I'm angry at God because I don't have the money or the status of life, etc., etc., etc. I'm angry at God. Now, again, Jesus is getting. I'm kind of want to brace you because Jesus is getting ready to bust that bubble. Let me also say that God is merciful. So why I'll say he doesn't care if you're angry with him, he is compassionate and he is merciful more so than I would be. Okay. All right. So we left off. He calls his apostles. Well, he calls his disciples. He actually separates 12 of his disciples and he names them apostles. These, of course, would be known as the apostles of the Lord. We also said that they are foundational apostles in that they laid the foundation of the Christianity, the truths, the faith. This is one of the things that God used them for. But then he goes on, and I'm going to pick it up. And he tells them, what they were to do immediately, right? They were to um, uh, he tells them for their little preaching tour. That you can almost say it's a training, kind of a training, right? Not, it's more than training in that he sends them out. You remember he sends them out. They have the gifts. They could heal, cast out devils, raise the dead, right? Cure leprosy, all manner of healing they had. And then he says, now go and preach the gospel. Take the gospel message. When he says to them, go and say, go and say, the kingdom of heaven has come to you. They were to present that kingdom with these gifts, healing, the miracles, whatever the people needed to be set free. They were to set that. And then he tells them how he wanted them to do it. And that's pretty much for that time. In other words, don't take any provisions for your food. Don't take extra clothing. By the way, this would be sort of the kind of template for hospitality, for Christian hospitality. That the Christians were designed, the community of Christians were to take care of the ministers. And by the way, and here the overall thought of why ministers should be cared for. And then as you get into a more organized church, as Paul in his pastoral letters, they were to be taken care of amply, well. So there's nothing wrong. In other words, there's nothing in Scripture that says that ministers were supposed to live poor. Now, believe it or not, if you look at the Catholic Church and let's say, just and only this aspect of it, because the Catholic Church itself is a very wealthy. I think, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, the Catholic Church may be the wealthiest institution on the planet. Okay, um, and that might have changed with some of the other conglomerates over the last 20 to 30 years that have come on the scene. Certainly, you know, Microsoft, Amazon, things like that. But the Catholic Church, and especially as a religious institute, is one of the most wealthiest. When you enter into their priesthood of the Catholic Church, right, you're taken care of by them. You don't, and of course they are taken care of well. But here's my point: what Jesus was trying to convey to them, the church takes care of them. God would take care of them. I like one of the slogans uh, of Chuck Smith of a former Calvary Chapel. He says, "Where God guides, God provides," and so and that's kind of how he operated. You didn't see him take offerings up, um, and things like that. They would, the principle is where God guides, God provides, and so. And the idea is that they were to depend on God, and that's what Jesus is telling them, that don't go from house to house, right? And because the focus is not what I'm going to receive. The minister's focus was not what I can get out of it, and of course that has so changed in our culture. We have millionaire, close to billionaire ministers today. And they've gotten that way, they've gotten that wealth from the people. They've gotten that from uh, following, partly legitimate, but in some cases they're, um, I think manipulating the people. So the idea is that certainly the ambition of the ministry, Jesus said you should have. If you have to minister, what is your ambition? What drives the minister? And if it's to get rich and wealthy, even sometimes you can say, I want to have a big church and all that kind of stuff. The minister's ambition should be to care for the flock of God. The minister's ambition should be, let me do what God has called me to do. That's what, and so, now I did ask this question. I'm not going to linger here. I did ask this question. Verse 15, he says, I assure you it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. Here's the interesting philosophical question. Notice he says that it would be more tolerable. In other words, um, he goes through and let me see if I can find that. He goes through. Well, let me go back and start. I'm going to start reading at verse 13. I'm going to start reading at verse 13. Um, he says, and if the house is worthy, let your peace return to it. But if, verse 14, if anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust of your feet when you leave that house or town. I assure you, it would be more tolerable on the day of judgment for that land, for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah, for that town. And again, just as a question, because he doesn't answer it here, but think about why he said that. In other words, if you go back to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, God in Genesis chapter 18, God appears. God and two angels appeared. God is talking to Abraham, and he's basically saying, I'm getting ready to judge Sodom and Gomorrah because they are exceedingly wicked. Okay. Um, and he sends the angels to there, and basically they rescue Lot, and then they rain fire and brimstone, fire and brimstone down on and Sodom and Gomorrah, by the way, was a metropolitan area. They probably had anywhere, it's estimated probably anywhere from a couple of 100,000, maybe 300,000 in the metropolitan area. Sodom and Gomorrah being the main cities. But they were exceedingly wicked. Most people kind of know them from the homosexuality, and even the term Sodom has came the two because the men of the city came and demanded to have sex with the two angels. Okay, that was just the perverseness of it. Truthfully speaking, God wasn't necessarily focusing on the homosexuality, but their depravity. If you go in the book of Judges, you see another incident where the same incident, a similar incident happened with the Benjamites. They approached his house and demanded to have sex with this man, but the man gave up his concubine, so they abused her. So the idea was that, of course, again, the difference with Sodom and Gomorrah, people thought or people assumed that God was judging Sodom and Gomorrah for the homosexuality, and that's not what that's not that wasn't the only sin, and that's the whole point. The point is that here, when by Jesus making the statement, it would be more tolerable, and I think in Luke he goes on a step further to say that if the signs and the wonders were done. Now let me go back and read this because I think he reads it down, and I want to come back to that statement here. So in verse 15 again, it says, "I assure you, it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town." Now, this was in response to the witness of the preaching of the gospel, and in particularly how the apostles delivered that presentation of the kingdom of God with signs and wonders. And so, for that town to then um, reject um, the gospel, this is what he's talking about right here. Okay, for the town to reject. All right. So, verse 16. Look, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be shrewd as serpents and harmless doves, because people will hand you over to the Sanhedrin and flog you in the synagogues. Beware of them. Um, beware of them. Verse 18. Who am I at? You will even be brought before governors and kings because of me, to bear witness to them and to all nations. Now he's kind of going off again prophetically to reaching beyond. You could say he's reaching even into the book of Acts and beyond the book of Acts. This is what Christians would face, particularly the apostles, however, because he's talking about their particular ministry to the nation of Israel. But then notice he also says right here, nations. You'll be brought before nations. So verse 19, but when they hand you over, don't worry about how or what you should speak, for you will be given what to say at that hour. And because you're not speaking, because it's not you that's speaking, but the Spirit of your Father that is speaking through you. Brother will betray a brother to death, and a father his child. Children will even rise up against their parents and have them put to death, and you will be hated. You will be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who doeth from the end will be delivered. And when they persecute you in one town, escape to the other, for I assure you, you will not have covered the towns of Israel before the Son of Man has come. Um, he said, let's see, did I get that? Verse 24. He said, the disciple is not above his teacher, and the slave above his master. He says, it is enough for his disciple to be like his teacher and the slave to be like his master. If they've called the head of the household Beelzebub, how much more of the members of the household? Now, the reason why I wanted to kind of go back over that before I jump into verse 26 here, um, because really Jesus, this is we have great promises, heirs of God, with joint heirs of Jesus Christ. Um, but in this life, okay, so those promises, the glorious eternity that we have, that's that's locked up, it's waiting for us, it's ours. Let me just say this: if you are a believer in Jesus Christ, um, you are as saved as you're ever going to get. You're not going to get more saved. You're just going to get more benefits, and the next thing that you will receive is your glorified body. But now, doing this life, okay, and this is what Jesus is saying: doing this life, it is not always going to be easy on several fronts. But right, in other words, the weakness, just the weakness of our bodies, right? The temptations, but the weakness. We're getting old, right? Okay, I'm 60 years old. I'm sorry, I just made 61. And the body just gets older, not younger. So that's a drag to put up with, right? Getting older. Uh, but then, of course, the world is getting worse and worse. It's more evil, worse and worse. And this is what he's talking about right here. And when it comes down to it, the one thing that Jesus will not compromise on, he will not ever say, I'm going to give you a pass on this, is how we confront, how we deal with these situations here. And he says this. He says, look, they call me Beelzebub. What do you think they're going to call you? And our job in terms of Christianity, and this is why he said that, is that the gospel message, when it is preached, when the gospel message is preached, will cause division. And by the way, that when Jesus, it is the natural result of it. And when you kind of go back and he says here, um, um, let's see, verse 21, brother would betray brother, and then a father's child. Again, this is not what Jesus is intending to do in terms of the gospel. It's the result of the gospel. When you stand for truth, it's going to divide because people don't want truth. So, verse 26, he says, therefore, now remember he told them that they would be arrested in some cases. They would be arrested. They're going to be jailed. They're going to be tortured. And as I said, some of the most severest case we saw towards the end of the first century, going into the second and third century. You had these bouts of persecution. In every generation since Christ's ascension into heaven, somewhere true Christians have suffered this kind of persecution. And so basically Jesus is saying to that, you just got to keep the faith. Okay? And look at verse 26. Therefore, don't be afraid. He says, therefore, don't be afraid of them, since there is nothing covered that will be uncovered, and nothing hidden that won't be made known. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the light, and what you hear in the whisper, proclaim in the household. Don't fear those who kill the body, but not able to kill the soul. Rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. So right there, he's telling you, if it comes down to it, you never to deny him, never to compromise. And by the way, remember, so he says, look, don't fear those who can only kill your body. And remember, there were many Christians who suffered horribly Um, Christian suffering has been some of the most brutal in history. Okay, brutal. The torture. And so you see what Jesus is saying about that here. Don't fear them, because the worst they could do is kill your body. And look, sidebar, the process of killing the body, yeah, it could be hard, brutal, torturous. And we oftentimes don't have to kind of face that, but I can only imagine. What I can only say is that if for some reason that I was in that situation where I've been tortured, and usually as a direct result of your faith, God's grace would be upon us to endure to the end. That doesn't really mean he's going to be delivered, but hey, uh, endure to the end. Now, verse 29 says, "Aren't two sparrows sold for a penny, yet not one of them fall to the ground without your Father's consent?" He says, "But even the hairs of your head are all been counted. So don't be afraid of them. You are worth more than sparrows." Now, when he says the number of your hair counted, not much here, right? So for some of us. Um, Again, but notice he says here, and this is what am I at here? Um, hmm. He says here, don't be afraid of them, verse 31. You are worth more than the sparrows. Now that's comforting, but don't forget what he also requires. Now, verse 32, "Therefore, everyone who will acknowledge me before men, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I will also deny him before my Father in heaven." And then he says, now that, by the way, this is non-negotiable. Period. This is period. Now we're going to see Peter deny Jesus in his face. Peter will repent, and he will be restored. But notice what Jesus is saying right here. If you deny him, the one thing, this is you. If you claim to be his disciple, period, unabashedly, period, right? He says you surrender. Okay. Um, Verse 34, "Don't assume I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to turn, let me see, for I came to turn a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, daughter-in-law against her father-in-law, and a man's enemies would be the members of his household." Um, Now, again, when we talk about language, keep in mind that the language here that we're referring to, the language, the way he is speaking, Jesus' gospel is not intended to bring world peace or unity. Um, there are some very misguided Christians who think that. Uh, there was a movement called the seeker-friendly movement. The seeker-friendly movement basically said, let's not say anything controversial. Let's not talk about people's sin. Um, and let's just talk nice to people. Now, after 30 years, the founders of that movement said, that didn't work, right? In other words, it never spiritually matured people. The idea was that seeker churches were great to fill pews, fill seats in the auditorium. That's what they went for. But they did nothing to spiritually mature people. So as a result, there are people who were saying, "Hey, I'm down with Jesus just as long as Jesus don't tell me about my sin. I'm down with Jesus as long as Jesus don't correct me. I'm down with Jesus as long as you don't say anything controversial." Well, he says right here, sorry, that's just not going to happen. The intent of the gospel is not to do that. The result of the gospel will. But notice what he says. Look here, verse 37. The person who loves his father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And the person who loves his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever doesn't take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. And anyone finding his life will lose it, and anyone losing his life because of me will find it. And again, this is some hard truth here. Okay, not hard and blunt. There it is, right there. Jesus said, "Look, if there is nothing or anyone that ever should come before him." So if you are a child and your parents said you cannot serve Christ, and this is gets I don't have time to get into a lot of kind of hashing out of the details. Um, Let me just say there are sometimes some details that need to be hashed out. For example, you have pastors, for example, that tell their wives that no matter what their husbands say, give their tithes. Well, that's not what Jesus is talking about right here. Those kinds of issues, whether or not your church membership and things like that, because Jesus, it, that what he is saying here doesn't apply to institutions, man-made institutions. And like I say, I don't have time to go in a lot in depth to that. But what he is saying is crystal clear is that no relationship, none, no relationship ever should come before Jesus Christ. He said, if you're faithfully following him, and you, the potential is that your relationship with God is going to cause problems. And he says, if so, you just have to go with that. Okay, you just have to go with that. So he says that, and so why? In this case, it is the eternal perspective that you ought to be looking at. All right, he says, let me see, did I finish what I need to finish here? All right. So he says right here, the one who welcomes you welcomes me, and the one who welcomes me welcomes him who sent me. Anyone who welcomes a prophet because he is a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And anyone who welcomes a righteous person because he is righteous will receive a righteous person's reward. Whoever gives just a cup of cold water to the one of these little ones because he is a disciple, I assure you, he will never lose his reward. Now, this is kind of interesting here. Notice he says, I want to, kind of interesting because he said, anyone who welcomes a prophet. Well, let me just emphasize, especially in terms of what's going on, of course, in our culture. That is referring to true prophets. Now, if we kind of go back, okay, remember how they were able to know who the true prophets were. How they were able to know true apostles, right? They came with credentials. They came healing the sick. True gifts, not fake. So that's the difference. What he is not saying is that just because someone comes, in the name of the Lord, that just because someone comes and say they're a prophet, say they're a great one, say they're anointed, that's not what he's talking about right here. Remember the harshness, the sternness. And let's kind of go back when he look at this in verse 5 again. He says, don't take the road leading to other nations, and don't enter any Samaritan town. Instead, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, announce this: the kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those with skin disease, drive out demons. You have received free of charge, and give free of charge. Now you remember I went and showed showed you the companion verse to that in Luke, where Jesus also anointed 70 disciples and told them to go and do the same thing: cast out devils, heal the sick, and they came back rejoicing. They said the devils are subjected to us. He said they're subjected to us in your name. So they proved to be true disciples and prophets and apostles. They proved that, right? They prove. So therefore, anyone rejecting that, that's when Jesus said, shake off the dust. All right? That's what. Now, on the other hand, he also says, those who then what? Welcomes you, meaning the true message, the one who welcomes you, the one who welcomes a true prophet, the one who will give just a cup of cold water to a true servant. He says he will in no wise lose his reward. Not only that, notice he says you'll receive the same reward. But that's true. Now, let me also say this. I think it's a mistake to give your money and your support to fake ministers. So there are people who say, I'm a healer, but no healing. I'm going to teach you how to get rich, but no one has gotten rich. Fake ministers. No, don't support them. But his exhortation, of course, to them is that I am sending you forth into a wicked world, that we are not to try to be friends with the world. And let me certainly say this. We're certainly not to we're not to compromise in favor of having a relationship with the world. Okay? Or to even avoid persecution. You know, I want people to like me. He said, no, we preach the truth. We present the truth, period. And that will cause division, that will cause people to react, and not always good. All right, guys. Chapter 11 in our next study. So I will see you, and thanks everybody for tuning in. I'll see you next time.